but we don't celebrate that with bells.
I'm going to mute everybody right now. We've just muted everyone. We're going to start the program in about 2 minutes. And I apologize, but there's too much noise going on. But we're still letting a lot of people in. So we'll start in about 2 minutes. Feel free to open your chat windows and talk to one another. And Rabbi Becky, I know you can only stay a short time. Did you want to say something before I introduce Steve?
No, it's just good to see Dr. Windmueller and to see everyone. For my TAS folk who are joining in, we are...
You're muted, Rabbi Becky.
So Kol Tikva approached us at TAS about joining together. In the past, Kol Tikva has had Dr. Windmueller as a presenter over the past few years, and I'm so honored that Rabbi John got in touch with me and with Rabbi Dahlia to share in this moment and to learn together. So we're just so grateful to join together these two communities and to share in this moment. So I'm grateful. So thank you to Kol Tikva for including us. And it's so good, as I said before, to see my new TAS faces and my, I don't want to say old, but my veteran Kol Tikva faces. So it's good to see all of these wonderful boxes together.
Rabbi, we want to wait a couple of minutes. It's still not quite up on YouTube, just so you know.
Karen, let me know when we can start.
Will do.
We took a long enough break though, correct? Because I already started the stream. We're already on YouTube, correct?
I don't see it yet, but fingers crossed it should be okay. We're working on it.
Okay.
I think the whole world is on YouTube right now.
Karen, we're on YouTube for sure. Lisa can see it. Karen, thumbs up yet? So right now we're just collecting people instead of actually having a speaker. This is a big trick. See how many people we can gather together at once. Great. All right, Laura and Glenn are telling me we're live on both, Karen. All right. So we're going to begin our program. Today I'd like to welcome, both Kol Tikva and Temple Ahavat Shalom, and of course their clergy, Rabbi Becky Hoffman and Rabbi Dahlia Szymanski. It is an honor to be doing this program with your community. So I am going to do a few quick ground rules. Everyone's going to be muted during the presentation, excuse me. And after I introduce Dr. Windmueller, he's going to do a 30-minute presentation followed by questions and answers. Rabbi Szymanski is going to be facilitating the Q&A. So if you have a question, write Rabbi Szymanski. Do not write me. Do not write everyone. Write Rabbi Szymanski. She's going to be grouping the questions together, deciding what order they should be presented in, and then she will be asking them directly to Dr. Windmueller. So now let me introduce Dr. Windmueller, who I almost gave the credit of being a rabbi, and he is such a great teacher. He really is my rabbi. I've spent many hours speaking with him, learning from him, reading his articles. And if a rabbi is a teacher, he truly is a great teacher. So Dr. Stephen Windmueller. He is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at HUC. Prior to coming to HUC, Dr. Windmueller served on the staff of the American Jewish Community, directed the Albany Jewish Federation, and the JCRC of the LA Jewish Federation. And during his tenure at HUC, Dr. Windmueller served for 10 years as the director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. And in 2005, he was named to the deanship of the LA campus. Quite an honor, and he did a great job in his stewardship of the campus. And between 2012 and 2014, he was invited to teach classes at both USC and Nanjing, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, University in China. He has written 4 books and numerous articles. He holds a PhD in political science. His research primarily focuses on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. And that's what he's going to focus on today is Jewish political behavior. He's going to be looking at the current upcoming election and the trends within the Jewish community and what he has, drawn from looking at these trends. Currently, he's editing a volume for USC's Kasdan Institute on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews, and that's scheduled for release in the summer of 2021. I look forward to reading it when it is released. So it's my honor to turn the screen over to Dr. Windmueller, and I'm going to mute myself so my image doesn't pop up.
Thank you, Rabbi Hanish, to Rabbi Hoffman, and to Rabbi Szymanski. Happy New Year, Gamar Tov, and I'm so pleased that I can be with the 2 congregations together this afternoon. I apologize if my voice sounds a bit hoarse, but this is a second time around, as I have been presenting this material earlier today to congregations elsewhere in the United States. I look forward to your questions and welcome the conversation that will follow. So I would ask that we post the slides at this time. So we're going to begin a conversation that will take us to the 2020 elections, but we will want to construct it in the context of where we have been as a community and as part of American society. The next slide, please. I mean, as we all know, the deep engagement that American Jews have had with the United States is extraordinary. And therefore our connections, which date back to the origins of this nation, are particularly significant. And we would bring to America over the course of our various immigration patterns a whole set of political ideas from socialism, anarchism, liberalism, and conservative political Jewish thought. We were clearly a depository of great ideas about what America could become and what kind of society it ought to become. We hold great pride both in our Judaism as expressed in the Pew Studies, and certainly by our behaviors as American citizens. We have been deeply engaged in American politics from the outset. Next slide, please. This long history of our political connection begins actually at the Revolution. Francis Salvador was the very first American patriot to be killed in the Revolutionary War, a Jewish American from Spain. He would be part of Washington's military service. He would represent the beginnings of a kind of statement of where we were with this contract with America that I think we have created. That contract is both written as well as it is symbolic. written in the context of the First Amendment to the Constitution, in which the declaration of separation of faith and culture and nation, as well as the rights of assembly and speech, were so central to our history and expression. It is also exposed and presented in the sixth article of the Constitution dealing with no religious tests. And it is reflected in a whole array of personalities that have been defined as part of the American the Jewish story. For example, we would remind ourselves that in 1845, the very first Jew was elected to the Senate, David Yulee from Florida. And in that same year, the House of Representatives would seat the first Jewish American in the House. But it would not be that easy, because Maryland, North Carolina, and New Hampshire were slow in welcoming and allowing Jews to sit in state legislatures, and those state legislatures, on the basis of the fact that they were not prepared to take the oath of office using a New Testament. This was to be a struggle until the mid-1800s to fully assure American political participation on the county, state, and city levels. But since that point in time, the American contract and the Jewish story has been tied to a whole array of personalities. Mordecai Noah in the period of the 1820s and his efforts to articulate the place of Jews in America with political leadership as he became a kind of voice of that story. And then the deep engagement of Jews with Abraham Lincoln in the period 1850 through his untimely death in 1865. Lincoln dies on Passover, 1865, and the funeral services and memorials associated with his death on the part of the Jewish community is an extraordinary statement of their patriotism and deep love of country. From 1864 until 1912, American Jews were deeply committed to the Republican Party, its values, and Lincoln as the ideological fountainhead of those views and ideas. And indeed, the Jewish community has remained politically connected and engaged, as we would see in the 116th Congress, the current Congress, with its 28 Jewish members and 9 US senators. 27 of our House members are Democrats and 2 are Republican. And as going backwards, we remind ourselves of the deep rootedness of Jews as part of the political establishment, with as many as 51 members of the 1993 Congress being part of our community, and reminding ourselves that since the 1800s, Jews have been candidates and funders and activists and commentators on politics going forward for this 150-year period. So in the history of 244 years of nationhood, the Jewish community has been an integral part of an unfolding national story. Our next slide, please. Certainly, as we have moved forward, we understand that Americans have the extraordinary opportunity, the franchise to vote. But tragically, many Americans do not vote. Only 60% of eligible voters have participated in elections. The most successful election in terms of participation was 1960. In the Nixon-Kennedy campaign, where more than 65% of voters in modern times would participate. Although in the McKinley campaign of the 1870s, those numbers were 70 and 80%. So we have seen a decline from 1960 forward in terms of the numbers of participants. I would remind you that by states, Maine has the most significant voter turnout, Hawaii the least. And the Jewish community, interestingly enough, as we compare data on this question of who votes, we believe that anywhere between 72 and 85% of eligible Jewish voters actually vote in elections. It has become part of their political mindset and a commitment to be practitioners in the act and art of voting. The second characteristic of Jewish political behavior is being active in terms of funding and supporting candidates. And the Jewish community now provides, according to most surveys, 1/2 of all monies raised in the Democratic Party, and 1/4 of all dollars raised for Republicans. In my own work on the 2016 election, I noted that Donald Trump had received, of his top 17 donors, 7 were Jewish Americans. And on Hillary Clinton's campaign, her top 5 donors were Jewish Americans. So what can we expect this November? What we will need to understand in particular is that voting will clearly be a question mark as to whether people will feel comfortable, how they will cast their votes, and how those votes will be accounted and dealt with. We are particularly concerned, as well as expressed by our major national Jewish organizations, in seeking to provide guidelines to their members in terms of the best way to vote and deliver those votes moving forward. Only 5 states in the Union have a kind of history of dealing with ballots that are delivered by mail. And that has been Oregon and Washington, Colorado, Hawaii, and California. Other states have far less of a history dealing with the use of ballots by mail. And that will be a challenge in many states, including the 27 states that are already available to vote as this election has begun. What we are going to be seeing in terms of the voting behavior in this election is in part reflected in the fact that we are going to see some 5 million new potential voters in 2020. As America grows a younger population base, we will see that the 139 million people who voted in 2016, those numbers are likely to go up not only on the basis of new voters, but on the basis of the fact that a significant number of people failed to vote in 2016, including a significant number of Jewish Americans. We believe that 10% of the normal Jewish vote did not take place in 2016. We base that on a Brandeis University study of millennials who were Bernie Sanders supporters, and these young voters simply sat out 2016. We see it also in a study on Republican Jewish voting, where we see a significant number of voters who describe themselves as never Trumpers not voting in 2016 or voting third party as an interesting outcome of that election. Next slide, please. What we know about Jewish voters is actually based on a number of studies and surveys, including exit polling that we have seen. So we immediately would point to the 2016 campaign again and remind ourselves on the New York Times exit poll that Hillary Clinton received approximately 71% of the Jewish votes, Donald Trump at 24%, which reminded the voice of Milton Himmelfarb, a sociologist who in 1973 suggested that Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans, as a reminder that our voting behavior is distinctive, and is distinctive in part because of American exceptionalism, of our notion of understanding America, but through a particular lens of Jewishness, Jewish values, and Jewish ideals. In reality, American Jews are congregated in basically a few states. 8 states account for 75% of who we are, representing about 188 of the necessary 270 electoral votes to be named president. Those 8 states contain some 17 major centers of high-density Jewish populations. Those 17 centers delivered to Hillary Clinton the bulk of her support in the states that she would win. So in close elections, we are watching in particular states, however, that have fewer Jewish populations, but are significant in 2020, and we call them the Bagel Belt states. They include Michigan and Wisconsin, certainly Arizona, Georgia, Ohio, and Florida, and one might actually put North Carolina in that list. These states account for much smaller Jewish populations for the most part, with the exception of Florida, but they are essential to any candidate who hopes to become president to be able to win. So the amount of attention being paid on the Jewish voters in those states, which account for 1% and possibly 2% of the voting base in those states, we understand to be significant on the part of the Republican Jewish Coalition and the Jewish Democratic National Council, both of whom are investing huge sums of money directed at those core voting states, the so-called purple states. Next slide, please. If we step back for a few moments, I think we can understand that Jewish voting behavior in the second half of the 20th century has been significantly aligned with the Democratic Party. And here we are looking at several of the outcomes of those elections. What we saw from 1916 to 1948 was a very high level of Jewish voting for Democratic candidates or third-party candidates. And third-party candidates do very well, especially with Jewish voters if they are left of center, and that we have seen in the case of socialist candidates in the 1920s and 30s, and we would see that in the case of independent voters in later years. We're going to move to the next slide, please. I want to call your attention to the top number here, the 1980 election between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. And I would remind you that the third party candidate here is John Anderson. This is the lowest ranking that Democrats have done in the 20th and into the 21st century in terms of voter outcomes. And one can look back on the Carter administration and analyze what were the factors associated with this downward trend. Reagan does particularly well for a Republican. He does as well and better than any Republican since the 1940s, and clearly has a particular and supportive ear to many voters from within the Jewish community. Yet we look at the 1984 election and see he drops by 8 percentage points. And political scientists have wondered why there would be this drop-off in the second campaign, and that is tied directly to the rise of the moral majority. The moral majority is created in 1983. It becomes a political force in the 84 elections, and this scares a significant number of Jewish Americans, which shifts some of the voting that we would see there. We see, for example, Barack Obama in 2008 with 78%, but again, a decline of nearly 10% into the 2012 election. And that is attributed to the fact that President Obama would lose support from women, from minority communities, and certainly in this case, the Jewish community between 2008 and 2012, but still drawing a significant percentage, certainly, of the Jewish vote. Next slide, please. I want to step here into looking at the two big traditions, conservative Jewish political thought and later liberalism and its political formation. Conservative political behavior is deeply rooted in Jewish history, meaning Jews have been basically conservative in their political outlook in much of the Middle Ages, early modernity, in part because it was important to be seen as aligned with the state, to be looking at the state as a force or source of self-interest and protectionism. In more contemporary times, Jewish Americans have contributed distinctively to the ideological and political thinking of the Republican Party in many different ways. And here we're going to look at 5 particular categories or behaviors of Republican voters. We have a significant number of Republican voters that I would classify as identity politics voters. They ask the question, as a Jew, what is important to me? And how would I deliver and need to deliver my vote? We have here many first generation and even some second generation American Jewish voters, along with other classes of voters. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. And that is reflected in the fact that this is the important sector of a significant number of where Republicans draw their support around this identity politics question. The neoconservatives were particularly prominent in the Reagan years and have been ideologically an important voice in the Never Trump Republican movement, but also in other aspects of Republican thinking on both domestic and foreign policy concerns. And they are an important and will be an important voice going forward as we look at the future politics. Ideological conservatives are those Republican Jews joining with other Republicans to support conservative economic, cultural, and moral positions about the role of government and governance in American society. And religious value conservatives are certainly those conservatives who are mostly Haredi and modern Orthodox Jews. And here I would point to some interesting data. The Haredi Jewish community will probably deliver something on the order of 68% of its votes to Donald Trump, based on all the surveys we have of Republican Jewish behavior in the Orthodox world. And modern Orthodox Jews are more likely to deliver only 36% of their votes to Trump's reelection in November. But they are an important voice. They are a growing voice inside both the Republican Party and in the Jewish community as well. The Never Trumpers, both in 2016 and now again, are very significant because a number of them are ideologically committed to his defeat and are very active in the Lincoln Project and in other ways of articulating their dissent over the president's behavior and practice, and are a part of a kind of voice of dissent inside the Republican Jewish establishment. Next slide, please. Liberal Jewish tradition comes from a different place in our history. In part, it is drawn from modern periods of assimilation and engagement in which Jewish thought, both in Europe and in the States, were tied to different perspectives about the economic and cultural and social outcomes for what is best for the society and for Jewish citizens as well. It is drawn from the social justice tradition within Judaism. It is tied as well to various movements that have taken place on behalf of labor, on behalf of the concerns of economic justice in the society. And it is a conglomerate of multiple voices that creates American Jewish liberalism. As Mark Dollinger of San Francisco State has suggested, there are many dimensions to progressive Jewish thought. So it is not simply one ideology, it is a series of ideas about what democracy ought to look like and how, as Jews, we ought to practice it. And there are different issues that in principle emerge as significant at any given time, whether it's climate change or economic justice or criminal justice, or whether it deals with a whole array of other social considerations. Here again, I see 5 types of Jewish Democrats in the United States, the kind of universal progressives whose values and ideas reflect much of what I've described, of religious tradition, as well as a political behavior drawn from the Jewish past. The liberal urban suburban Democrats are voters who are more cautious, often pick and choose their politics, tend to vote their pocketbooks on local and state elections, tend to vote nationally in a kind of ideological affinity with the National Democratic Party and Jewish collective interests. Urban activists are younger American Jews, many of whom are no longer necessarily of a particular party, but are independent voters, many of whose families or parents have come to the political scene from within the Democratic tradition. The 4th category are a fascinating group. These are the red diaper babies. These are the grandsons and great-grandchildren of the socialists, who in the 1930s fought for the rise of labor and the rights of the worker, who in the 1960s were central to the war against Vietnam, and who in today's world have become the Bernie Sanders supporters and have been the articulate voice that has opposed basically other perspectives within the Democratic Party and certainly outside of it. The final category, which you said might say to me, well, doesn't the libertarian voice belong on the Republican side? Not in the case of Jewish voters. Herb Weisberg of Ohio State University, in his new book on American Jewish political behavior, suggests that Jewish libertarians are unique in that they see their ideas aligned with the Democratic Party, but that they would prefer many of the practices of the party to be designed not to impose the role of government on solving problems, but that it should be an alliance with nonprofits and others to deal with the management of great social issues with far less government engagement. So this is an interesting new development in terms of Jews who are libertarians and yet remain in some measure Democrats. Next slide, please. What shall we expect in this election season? I think we are all aware that this election is about the current president. We are also aware of the amount of disinformation and suppression that has been discussed and challenged. We are also aware of the foreign influence. My sources indicate that there are as many as 10 countries that are seeking to, in some shape, define or influence American political behavior. Russia, China, North Korea, and Venezuela amongst them. Iran is the fifth of these countries that reflect this type of a decision to try to reframe the American electorate. Clearly, discussions about ballot counting and the role of the 12th Amendment to the Constitution dealing with the Electoral College and how it shall be managed are critical questions, as is the post office and its ability or capacity to deliver in a timely fashion votes. And I would remind you that all voting is defined and operated at the state level. This is not about a national consensus on how one votes and when votes are due and how votes are counted. Each state has its own guidelines, priorities, structures, and laws. One of the things that is of grave concern to the American Jewish community is conspiracy theories and the very threat of those theories on behaviors in terms of anti-Semitism, anti-African American, and anti-immigrant behaviors and practices. And this is a concern that is certainly very much central to much of the Jewish community's current political involvement. The trust factor. American Jews have always believed that democracy flourishes when people believe in the system, vote, are knowledgeable, and engaged. Trust is therefore a very core issue about how many Americans have lost faith or are in despair over what has happened and question government or government's authority and ability to function. And this is a major concern that the Jewish community itself will and has been addressing. It is interesting in this particular election to remind ourselves the close connections that the American Jewish community has with candidates and their families. Donald Trump's son-in-law and his grandchildren and their Jewish ties. Joe Biden and his 3 children and their connections through marriage to our community. And these remind us of this deep embedded character of the Jewish community's ties to American politics. We saw this in Hillary Clinton's family as well, and we have seen it in earlier elections of other candidates and presidents who have had deep personal as well as familial ties to our community. I think the issues before us are deeply tied to the American populism. This is a 1840s notion of America first. Andrew Jackson created many of the ideas that the current administration is employing. His view of America was a sense of putting the country first and challenging the nation to think of its self-interests over its global and international roles and responsibilities, or that of necessarily inviting and welcoming new folks into this nation. So there are those Americans who are seeking desperately at this moment as they explore how they will behave and vote politically to a road that defines a place where they will feel secure, the road to somewhere. Others through this process are looking to see a changing America, understanding that our role is different, our society is fundamentally different, and that we will be going elsewhere, that the road will take us to new and uncertain places. So the state of our democracy is really about these two visions of society that are certainly challenging to how we see ourselves in the world. Next slide, please. I mean, I think when we come down to it, we need to understand that whether or not Jews vote is certainly a personal choice. But the high degree of political engagement by American Jews suggests that we will be continuing to vote at relatively high numbers. I am of the mind that some of those who sat out at 2016 will be likely to return. I do think we will see any growing voice of orthodoxy in American Jewish life in general, and as voters, new voters in particular, as we move forward. This is based on both the population data. It is also seen in terms of the influence of this sector inside the Republican Party as an important ally and voice within that world. I also see a new Jewish left that is particularly active, progressives who align with a number of ideas that will split likely parts of the Democratic Party and will be challenging to the future of politics in this country as we go beyond this election. What we began to notice in 2018 was a surge in Jewish giving, especially to political causes and candidates in the 2018 election. And we are seeing that again in this election. And what we are likely to see as a result of this kind of political organizing is that this election will be amongst the most expensive in the history of the Republic. In the Obama and Romney election of 2012, each candidate spent $1.2 billion for that campaign. We believe we're on a pathway for 2020 to see that number exceeded. And just over the past weekend, following the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we saw a huge amount of both Jewish and general giving into the Democratic campaign. And we have a report from this immediate past weekend of a significant upgrade in Republican giving in light of the Supreme Court nomination of the current new candidate to the court, and a effort to strengthen the Republican presence and moving into the last 37 days of this campaign. We are all concerned about social media and the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant behaviors, and that will be another an important news story to this overall election feature. Next slide, please. I think that the American Jewish community is at its primacy in terms of its political connections, engagements, and activities. It is a profound statement of the fact that American Jews are so identified politically as Republicans and as Democrats. And this has been really the storyline of much about this period. But this is going to be changing. America itself is rapidly and radically changing. By the year 2050, the United States will no longer be a white majority society. The rapid rise of new voters and of the changing demography of the nation suggests fundamental shifts in our political structure and behavior. Islam, for example, will replace Judaism as America's third major religious community in only 20 to 25 years from now. And the other outcome here is what we know. We are amongst the oldest religious ethnic voter base in America. We are indeed the oldest white ethnic American base. And that is reflected in the fact when we look at what Jews care about in voting, we see it reflects this age cohort reality. I think political parties themselves are going to be changing. This election may trigger a significant amount of repositioning of political behavior in this country, and we will not be able to tell what that characteristic will look like at this moment, but it is significant. I would remind you that 64% of American Jews believe that right-wing anti-Semitism is a major threat. Another 16% believe that left-wing or anti-Israel BDS behaviors are seen as problematic to Jewish interests and to our well-being, adding yet another dimension of the story of hate and anti-Semitism. Next slide, please. I think the issues before us are really all about the questions of leadership, but even leadership beyond 2020, as I think we will see significant changes in both the House, the Senate, certainly potentially in other parts of the political establishment as to how we move forward beyond this current generation of political leaders. Nothing could be clearer than the Supreme Court. American Jews put a great deal of attention and belief that the court defines values, and the court is ultimately an important framework for defining America and Americanism in the eyes of our voters. And we will come back to that in a moment when we look at a few of the voter responses to what is important to Jewish American votes. I see rebuilding the economy, dealing with the health system and new technologies, certainly the welfare of the public square and how we're going to be managing the anger and disruptiveness to the social order. All of these, along with gun safety, and by the way, gun safety is a very high profile issue for Jewish Americans based on every one of the last number of studies that we have available. And certainly moving beyond the pandemic, how will this country heal itself, both financially, medically, culturally, and economically? Next slide. Here is a sampling of the high degree of attention that Jews of this generation are giving to issues. This study that was done over the last 6 months of 1,150 American Jewish voters is confirmed by an American Jewish Committee study and by others that point to the issues of healthcare, gun violence, Social Security, and Medicare as very high profile issues for American Jews, reminding ourselves about, again, the importance of age as a factor and about the sense of national security and welfare of the population as an important ingredient. You will notice that Israel ranks really low here. And I want to point out, this is not because American Jews don't care about Israel. In fact, there is a very high identity with Israel. The Pew study reflects that number to be well in excess of 80%. But in terms of voting behavior, only for those Jews that I would describe and have described as identity politics voters who place, is it good for the Jews, does the Israel equation even emerge as a significant factor? What it means is that Israel, unless challenged by threats from outside or challenged by a poor relationship with Washington, the Israel card simply does not emerge as a powerful voting incentive at this moment. So it can move, but is not likely to be an important indicator. We believe it has made a difference in this campaign to Orthodox Jews, especially to those who welcome the president's recent initiatives with the countries of the Gulf. And we have seen some movement in the part of Jewish voters amongst that sector to see Israel as an important expression of their support for this administration. Next slide. Finally, I wanted to end my conversation with you this afternoon by simply pointing to the reality that we are, as I have noted, a changing community. Changing in the sense that our role as significant political players will in some degree be challenged and in other ways diminished by demographic factors and by the changing nature of how Jews are looking at themselves, Jewish identity, and Jewish assimilation, all contributing to a reassessment of where we fit into this political culture. The biggest challenge for Jews at the moment is that we are, for the first time in our history, being challenged in this particular political climate by both the right and the left. The alt-right threatening to suggest, as it did in Charlottesville and elsewhere, that Jews are in a sense seeking to replace them, seeking to replace whites as the power base in America. By the left, the challenge is seen as Jews are seeking to express their whiteness using their power and politics in ways that no longer give credit or distinction to their previous state as the victims of history and as a community that seeks to appeal to the power base, but rather has become the power base. That is a new challenge, and it could be rather destructive and challenging to the Jewish community moving forward, both inside the two parties, but more collaboratively or collectively in terms of how the society itself understands and treats minorities and Jews in particular. The civic engagement question is very important for Jews. We believed, as I suggested in the earlier slide, that trust in this democracy is an essential ingredient for it to succeed. And if Americans no longer believe in the society, then all bets are off in terms of how we will be able to both protect our interests or advance the larger and social agendas of American democracy as a whole. I thank you for your patience with this presentation. I look forward to entertaining your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Windmueller. That was an enlightening presentation. As always, Rabbi John spoke also. Rabbi Becky, Rabbi John, and I have all studied with you and are so excited to have you back. So we've gotten a lot of different questions. I've tried to synthesize some of them into general questions. One thing I've been asked several times about is to talk about the Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Movement, and especially their growing anti-Israel and anti-Semitism. How is that impacting Jewish participation, not only in BLM, but voting democratically?
It's a great question. And to the three rabbis, may I suggest we arrange another conversation specifically about the issues of African-American Jewish relationships, its historic base, its contemporary and evolving one. This is very complex, and so I will be very brief, but it hardly answers such a complex set of questions. The bottom line for this election is that yes, some American Jews have moved in both camps. Democratic Jewish voters even more concerned than ever about economic and social justice, about criminal reform, and about dealing with the sort of underbelly of American society, which needs to be addressed and managed in a much more coherent and successful way. And on the other side, by Republican or leaning Republican voters who believe and fear that law and order must be retained, question many of the ideas being discussed, including the defunding of police and other themes, including the levels of anti-Semitism that may have been articulated. Because of the characteristics of Black Lives Matter, it is a bottom-up organization, does not have a national agenda. It is something that we need to understand. Many people confuse the movement for Black lives with Black Lives Matter. The movement itself is ideologically problematic. It was created in 2015, and its political agenda has been clearly hostile on Israel. And that was posted in their platform of about 5 years ago. But their platform posted in August of this year has taken that issue out. So what we don't know is whether or not there's a rethinking of the issue. And what we need to find out is how we can engage with key voices in the Black Lives Matter movement to find a road forward where there are going to be shared interests and interests that we will diverge upon. So we clearly are going to be moving in several directions as this all evolves.
Great, thank you. Another question I was asked from a couple of different congregants was the question of the ultra-Orthodox. That can you expand a little bit on why they are so supportive of President Trump? And then also in relation to that, does his support from the KKK and other anti-Semitic groups impact or change their support of Trump?
Thank you, Rabbi. First of all, on the latter piece to the question, I think many Republicans dismiss as not a grave concern the extreme right. They view it as minimalist, as more an annoyance, and not as the central part to either the president's agenda or to the Republican Party's primary concerns. Democrats clearly may disagree and have disagreed with that notion, but I just want to point that out. On the issue of why Orthodox or Haredi Orthodox in particular are so strongly Republican, this has been an evolving relationship with evangelical Christians and other voices that share commonalities on such issues. as religious choice, religious values, on questions affirming support for parochial aid, on matters related to basic beliefs about social order and family as very central themes. So we find some conservative Latinos, evangelical Christians, fundamentalist African Americans, and Orthodox Jews in a kind of interesting coalition, all about a different definition of the role of religion in American society, which suggests that religion ought to be in and of the public square, influencing and shaping the society's values, similar to what the moral majority may have represented, as I described early in the presentation. I think that the president's actions with regard to the Supreme Court, his actions with regard to the Gulf states, have all simply reinforced the religious community's support for this administration, and likely to energize their voters to show up and be very much in tune with the Trump position.
And actually, to expand a little bit on the recent peace treaties with UAE and Bahrain, is that going to bring, even though Israel was listed as number 4, is that going to actually increase support outside of the Haredi, outside of the Orthodox community for President Trump?
Oh, yes, for sure. I mean, we clearly have a base of voters who view Israel's security as a core ingredient to their understanding of the role of the presidency, and that the presidency in their mind needs to, in some measure, reflect this very special relationship. So Barack Obama faced a huge challenge to that question around the issue of the Iranian nuclear accords. It divided the Jewish community. It generated a significant amount of support for the president's opponents. And it also generated a base of people who believed a different definition of the US-Israel relationship was in order, one in which the United States could criticize Israel as well as align with it. It has therefore created this great divide, as I've described in the earlier presentation, that we see inside the Jewish community, where families are not talking with families. Israel is one of those issues around which there is this disagreement. Other factors involve the president himself, and still other factors deal with other values that divide American Jews with one another.
Thank you. Another question that I received is, who among our past presidents or would you consider anti-Semitic, and who has been the most sympathetic to the Jewish community?
I think it's an interesting question. I am not a presidential scholar, but I will give you what I do know. I mean, I think there were 4 or 5 presidents who had a very deep affinity with the idea of Jewish nationhood. And I begin with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and even Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln spoke to this issue quite often, and not just with his Jewish friends, but his Christian Pentecostalists, because on the basis of his belief and their belief that the second coming was clearly tied to a holy land in which there would be a Jewish presence. But there were other presidents as well who were deeply bound and held strong opinions about this notion of return of the Jewish people to their homeland. I have done some study of Herbert Hoover, an interesting personality unto his own, and there I see a bit of that same characteristic of passion about Jewish nationalism. Anti-Semitism. Ulysses S. Grant was charged because of the military order number 11 as being an anti-Semite. The irony is that in his presidency, he becomes one of the great supporters of Jewish concerns about anti-Semitism in Russia and in Romania and elsewhere in Europe. And so he becomes a spokesperson in many ways for Jewish interests. So it's an uneven story having to do with Ulysses S. Grant. I find it quite fascinating that many presidents will tell you of the imprint of their religious beliefs and the personalities in their lives that have shaped their thinking. Bill Clinton speaks about his pastor as being an important influencer in his ideas about Israel. Jimmy Carter, even though the Jewish community may have had and continues to have certain differences with President Carter, held also this very strong notion about the Jewish presence in the Holy Land. It gets expressed in different ways on the policy side than it does on the theological or religious base. But it is an interesting piece to the fact that relatively few presidents have and could be defined as anti-Semitic. They may have some negative views on or about specific Jewish personalities or Jewish affairs, but were overwhelmingly, because of the closeness with which most of these administrations of all 45 presidents we have had interesting relationships with individual Jews and with the Jewish communities at varying times.
I think we have time for one more question. We're going till 3:15, correct, Rabbi John? Okay.
You
So I think
can go a few minutes over that, but not much.
Okay.
2 or 3 minutes past 3:15.
So another question that we have is about the younger generation of Jews. That are they expected to vote in numbers as large? You said that Jews have often voted higher than the general population, and are their political affiliations mirroring that of the older generation, or are you seeing a shift?
Well, we have some conflicting material here. I mean, if we took 2016 and as an outlier in a sense, we saw some realities there of Jews not voting in the same numbers. And I described some of the factors to that. And these were younger Jews. I think what we are likely to see is a more of an independence of younger Jewish voters, meaning they are not going to be lockstep Democrats any more than they will be lockstep Republicans. They are likely to be sort of figuring out for themselves what seems to work and what combination of relationships and alliances and voting behaviors make the most sense. The third factor is that I'm of the mind that they will not, that is younger voters will not represent the same volume of voting because we are simply not reproducing the kind of numbers in the Jewish community that we see and have seen elsewhere in our history or that other communities are producing. So that the sheer volume of Jewish voters will decline, and the shifts of where those voters will be located is also likely to change. So the diminution of the Jewish vote will be changed both by volume and by geography.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more short answer. That you went over some of that slide that had the main issues for Jewish voters, but is there a breakdown between Republican and Democrat? That what is the top 1 or 2 issues for Jewish Republicans versus Jewish Democrats?
So there at least I have not been able to identify a poll that does break it out by party, but we do know the following. Republican Jewish voters, as with Democratic Jewish voters, take on the general characteristics of the larger electorate. We are not all that distinguishable in the sense that we don't reflect the larger sort of society's values and behaviors and priorities, which means for Republicans, national security, fighting against terrorism, issues of Israel-US relationships, as we've described, a concern about an economy that is not filtered or controlled by a huge amount of restrictions, thereby allowing for free enterprise to flourish. We see on the Republican side a particular emphasis on both religious and social freedoms, including the right of people to bear arms. And there are, by the way, groups of Jewish Republicans who have formed alliances with others on the Second Amendment in support of security and the right to bear arms. And part of that is also borne out in protecting the interests of the Jewish community, meaning the rise again of defense groups in this country, which we are seeing in a few cities, of Jews who have armed themselves to protect Jewish institutions in light of some of the street violence we've seen. So on the Republican side, it is about the same core values that we might find among many other Republicans, with a particular emphasis on the welfare and security of Jews and Jewish interests. On the Democratic side, those tend to be much more universal characteristics, meaning criminal justice, immigration, health, as we've described, and the whole array of these smorgasbord, if you wish, of core interests, beginning with climate change. Climate change is particularly interesting because younger American Jews have identified it as very central to their identity and to their political passions. So we see these two sort of columns, definitively reflective of the cultures of their part of American life and society, and clearly in conflict with one another. So it's as if we have created a two-prism Jewish world of Jewish republicanism and of Jewish democratic ideologies.
Great. I think I want to ask one follow-up question to that is, what does that do to Jewish institutions? What is this divide as the world is becoming so divisive due to our Jewish institutions that house both Republicans and Democrats?
Rabbi, this is a really interesting issue. I spoke with the as many of you know, the Reform Movement has in Washington a Religious Action Center, and there I addressed a number of your colleagues on this question. And I described to them that there were really 9 behaviors that we're beginning to see in Jewish life as a result of this question. What can we do in a society and a communal system in which we are in a sense frozen, where we have very clear Republican interests and very defined Democratic interests? And what role does the rabbi and the rabbinate play? And what role can the congregation play? And rather than walk through the 9, the point is that there are various models by which rabbis, communal leaders, and board leaders of synagogues are trying to sort of figure out a pathway forward. What it has done in some cases is silence the pulpit. In other cases, it is really created a kind of freezing of discourse. And that is true in community organizations, which once might have taken positions on gun control or on abortion, and are now, in a sense, in limbo, unable to move because of the steep and very clear divides that we see inside the Jewish community. Some American sociologists are saying, well, that's the natural outcome of being a 4th or 5th generation American society, that we have come to the point of maturing to the point where we take on all of the characteristics that American society as a whole is taking on. And the Jewish community is going to, in a sense, have to sort of rewire itself to figure out how it moves forward, maybe not in the same framework of dealing with some of these core issues that were sort of how we often saw prophetic Judaism play out, or how we saw in the case of the Republican side, self-interest Jewish values or positions play out. And that we may need to be a different kind of communal system that allows for this diversity of behavior and thought, which is very challenging because it changes fundamentally the role of the leader and also the role of the community.
Thank you, Dr. Windmueller. On behalf of both congregations, you have both the clergy, I've seen both presidents on the call as well. I want to thank you for your insight, for your wisdom, and for your time. I want to remind the Kol Tikva congregants that you're going to stay in this room. I believe your next session or your afternoon service is starting. And for TAS, we have a little bit of a break, and our afternoon service is starting at 4:45. The TOT service is currently happening right now. All of those links are in the emails that you received. 4:45 is our afternoon service, 5:30 our Yisker, and 6:15 our Ne'ilah service. I want to wish everyone in both communities and you, Dr. Windmueller, a Shana Tova Umetuka. May this year be for all of us a year of health, a year of goodness, and hopefully a year of gathering together again. Shana Tova.